So here we are, Montanans getting ready to have an election, and it may not seem important, but it is gravely important to our nation. This is a very important election. Of course, all are, but I have a feeling this one is of paramount importance. And I wanted to share with you some thoughts before you go to the polls. And it probably has to do more with Matt Rosendale and Jon Tester than it does with any other candidates. I just want to share with you some thoughts that I think we need to think about. First of all, the television commercials and the ads don't contain a lot of substance. And what I mean by that is they'll say one person voted for this or one person didn't vote for that. But the underlying problem of that is when the Congress writes bills, a lot of times in bills there's things in there that are not good. There's pork funds and things like that. So like one bill maybe have support for the military, but it contains a lot of other bad things, and so one won't vote for that. And then in the advertising they'll say they didn't vote for the military, and so that's why you can't always trust that. I think we need to look at a more fundamental level when we look at our candidates, a more ideological level when we look at our candidates. Here's the thing that we really need to consider. Do you want to be a slave? Do you want to be a slave? And that you really have to ask yourself, because you may not think you are being enslaved, but every day we are enslaved. Enslaving means where there is someone who is in charge of you, someone you must rely on to take care of you. Some people are enslaved to a husband or to a girlfriend or a wife. Some people are enslaved to a boss, where they feel like they can't get out of the situation because they're too dependent. And that's what happens in countries. The governments become to a place where they are control of everything, and the citizens feel like they have no choice but to bow down, and then the government can then do whatever it wants. Well, it's all right to be enslaved to someone who's kind and generous and willing to take care of you. But once you become enslaved, you have no choice over who your master will be. And once we become enslaved to a government, then whenever that government changes hands, we could be in very deep trouble. Our forefathers knew this, and they started a nation where that is set up in order to prevent that. So the first thing I want to tell you about being enslaved is health care. Health care is an agenda to enslave you. I had a health care program, insurance, when I worked with a company. And when Obamacare came into pass by law, I was dropped. And so I had to pick up Obamacare. And the first year it seemed okay. The rates were quite affordable, and deductions or I can't think of the word right now, though, what you have to pay in front were okay. But as the years progressed until last year, 2017, my monthly payments on that would have been $1,400 a month, and I would have had a $6,000 deductible for me and my wife, and it was something like $10,000 combined. Now, all this talk about you have to have pre-existing coverage. Well, my wife was diabetic, and even though we had insurance, it didn't have any prescription on it. But there was, who cares if it was pre-covered, because you had to pay $6,000 before they would even help you. And the other thing about it was, I didn't have to pay the $1,400 a month because I was being subsidized by the government. And many of you may be subsidized by the government. And that's the key that you have to watch out for. Because the government wants to do this to you. They don't want you to afford health care on your own. Well, I shouldn't say the government. There are certain parties and certain people, and there is an agenda that they don't want you to afford health care because they want you to be dependent upon them. Once you become dependent upon them, then they can dictate a lot about you. Think about back during the Obama era when the IRS was delaying tax-exempt status to conservatives because they didn't want them to get them, and they would then fight against Obama. And this has come out and been acknowledged by the IRS that it was done. Well, imagine you have health care, and the people in charge of health care decide to target a certain group of people and deny coverage or delay coverage because they don't want them around. Well, that's what will happen with social medicine. You say, oh, that doesn't happen. Well, we have this mentality that it won't happen to me or it won't happen to here. But when we look around, we realize things do happen, and they do happen to nations. So socialized healthcare is an enslaving system, is what it does. And Jon Tester has been on board with this all along, and he has done nothing to help us out. All he's done is to cause costs to go up. And the reason that was done, and it's well known, they're trying to break the system for everybody to get fed up, and they go to one-payer government system. Second of all, the ideology. America is a great country, and it's different than all countries because it has a great system of government that our forefathers set up. We are not a true democracy, because a true democracy is where is like a mob rule, and if enough people say you're wrong, even though you could be right, and that's not the way this nation's supposed to operate. So it was a republic, and it was set up that there was Congress, which was the legislative branch of the government. They were the ones who were in charge of creating laws. And we elect these representatives to go to Washington and to fight among themselves, because we don't all agree. That's Americans. We just don't all agree about things. So what we do is we send representatives, and they hash it out, and they finally come up with laws that most of the time, if not always, are a sense of compromise. And it has to be that way because we don't always agree. So they write the laws. And then you have the executive branch, which is the Department of Justice, the president, and all that. And they're the ones who are supposed to carry out the laws as they're written. And then you have the judicial branch, and the judicial branch is to make sure that the laws that Congress writes are being adhered to. So an illustration is, imagine that for some reason people thought that, hey, we don't have to wait for a walk signal on a traffic light to cross a street. And so we all argue about this, and wherever we send our representatives to Washington. And some say you don't have to, you can go you can just watch when it's clear. And others say, no, you have to wait. And this goes on for months. And finally they come to a compromise, and they write this law about how people ought to cross the street. And so then the executive branch is supposed to execute that and make sure that the law is being enforced. But someone decides, hey, I'm going to walk across the street. Let's say the law says you have to wait for the light, and someone says, I'm just going to walk across the street. So the executive branch arrests the person because they violated the law. And they say, well, I didn't violate the law, so they go before the judge. Now the judge, his job is to say, what does the law say? You've broken it. But here's what happens. And this is what Judge Kavanaugh testified on the stand about what needs to take place and what he would do, and what a constitutional or a textual judge will do. They will look at the law and they will say, that's what the law says. But what happens with liberal judges or progressive judges is they look at the law and say, well, I don't quite like that law. I don't quite agree with it, so I'm going to input my opinion into that. And they have no right to do that, you see, because there's separation of powers. Because once a judge says, I don't like the way Congress wrote this law, I don't like what they did, and he makes his opinion, then our voting and all the work of the representatives in Washington who are supposed to legislate are nullified because the judge says he doesn't agree. And that's not what a judge is supposed to do. And so there is an enemy of this country would realize the only and the quickest way to change a nation is to get judges who will not stick to the law, but they will interpret it, or they will put their own opinion on it. They will inject their own legislation into it. And so this is why Jon Tester did not vote for Kavanaugh. This is why Jon Tester will not vote for, or did not vote for Neil Gorsuch, and he will not vote for Kavanaugh, because he is on board with this progressive agenda that doesn't want to follow the way that our nation's supposed to run. And what they're trying to do is force themselves upon you, because what you do is when you create judges who have an agenda that's your agenda, and they can override everything, then you have a small group of people. That's called an oligarchy. It's not a monarchy, it's called an oligarchy. But basically, then they can dictate the nation. So again, we see this very same thing going on, where they don't want you to have the choice in your health care and you to take care of yourself. They don't want you to have representation in Washington. And the last thing that's important, and you may not think it isn't, but it is fundamental to our nation. Our Constitution says that, our Declaration of Independence says that all our rights certain rights are endowed to us by our Creator. That would be God. In other words, there are things that God has granted to each one of us that no government, no man can take away. And that's a fundamental principle of this country, that there are things that each of us are entitled to as a human being placed on this earth by his Creator, and that others shall not take them away from us. And that's why we do the Pledge of Allegiance, one nation under God. We have in God we trust on our money, and God's been part of our government all along. Now, that doesn't mean that has to dictate what God you believe in necessarily. It's just that you believe in the Creator, sovereign God who has given you rights. Now, I don't remember what year it was, but in the Democratic Party at their convention, a pastor brought forth the declaration of how God would be incorporated into the Democratic Party, and it was highly booed. And that should scare everyone who's a Democrat. Things that the Republicans do scare Republicans. That should scare every Democrat. Well, Jon Tester goes along with this kind of mentality if you look at his voting. And the reason they don't want God in the party is, again, it comes back to this idea. If there is a God and he has granted you inalienable rights, then there are certain things the government cannot do to you. But you remove God, and now all of a sudden rights are given by man. And again, the underlying philosophy is they are trying to suppress you like every other nation in this world. We are the most freest nation in the world because of our government, but there is a concentrated effort in this nation to undermine that, and Jon Tester has gone along with every one of these things. Now, I'm not saying everything Jon Tester's done is bad. I'm not saying he's an evil man under this conspiracy, but he's just false step with the rest of these people, this progressive agenda, and so it's time that we remove him. In my opinion, you can do what you want, but it's time we remove him and get somebody in there who's willing to work and to fight for us to become independent people that can afford our own health care, that can take care of ourselves, that can work at jobs that will pay good wages, and that we do have rights that our government cannot take away. Because the last thing I want to say is if a judge can make his own determination, then when it comes to the Second Amendment, the First Amendment, or any amendment in there, it is void and null, because the judge can say, I don't agree with this, and so therefore it's not true, and erase all that's been done. Think about this. This is the underlying philosophy that we need to resist, and all those who lockstep with that, we need to vote against. And so that's my thoughts. Take it as you will. Get out and vote. Thanks.